from Bethpage, New York, to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where those ballots and the trailer in which they were shipped disappeared. Also, the evidence that we have obtained indicates that on several occasions, completed ballots were shipped from a postal facility in Bethpage, New York, a postal facility that has no mail processing role in the United States Postal Service, a postal service facility that has no ability to receive incoming mail because it does not have the machines to process that mail, a postal service facility which, from persons that we've spoken with, has no basis to have completed ballots on its premises. This evidence demands investigation. This evidence demands answers. The American people deserve such answers. We have and we are in the process of sharing this information with law enforcement. We have been contacted and we have communicated with offices for the FBI as well as United States attorneys in various jurisdictions in this nation. We have also been in contact with local prosecutors who are aware of some of our evidence. I can't speak to the scope of their investigations or to the status of their investigations. With me today are, on my right, on your left, Colonel Tony Schaefer. Colonel Schaefer has been our lead investigator for the Amistad Project, and he also accompanied me in our interview and debriefing with Mr. Jesse Morgan, who is seated next to him, who will share his story today. And Colonel Schaefer will also explain some of what Jesse will tell you that he saw and experienced on October 21st. To my left is Ethan Pease. Ethan Pease worked for a subcontracting firm for the United States Postal Service. And he's going to relate to you a story that occurred in Wisconsin when he arrived at a postal facility. Madison?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Ethan. In Madison, Wisconsin, and by two separate people on two separate days was informed that ballots were being gathered on November 4th and backdated on November 3rd, tens of thousands of ballots to be delivered and counted by postal workers in that facility. To my left and to your far right is Gregory Stenstrom. Mr. Stenstrom is a computer expert. He also was a poll watcher in Delaware County. During that process, and he will describe this for you, and he's also testified, I believe, before the Pennsylvania legislature recently, he will describe to you how he was denied access. All of you know those stories. And again, I just want to mention that people deny access for a reason. They don't follow the law for a reason. And denying access to the counting room was a violation of law. We've experienced an unprecedented election in American history where America was kicked out of the counting room. All of us remember looking at the hanging chads and the dimpled chads and debating what the intent of the voter was, and that is right for America to participate in that debate. For the first time in our nation's history, in our urban core, in swing states, America was kicked out of the counting room. And you must ask, why? Why? Gregory Stenstrom will share something with you that might indicate the why. Because the conduct of the officials that he witnessed and of a private party violated all of the rules to maintaining in integrity the election and cast serious doubt upon the management of the election in Delaware County, and his observations have been mirrored elsewhere as well. Mr. Jesse Payne. Mr. Jesse Payne, to my immediate right, is a subcontractor, drives a truck for a subcontractor of the United States Postal Service. He's going to tell you his story here in a moment, but I want to help set the scene for you regarding that story. Jesse is not here to tell you that the election was stolen. He's not here to tell you that he knows enormous fraud occurred. He's here to tell you what he saw. And at great personal cost, he's willing to tell you what he saw. Don't put the burden of proving fraud on this man's shoulders. He's come here to tell you what he saw. On October 21st, Jesse was engaged in, well, let me back up. I'm sorry, Peter, let me back up. I'm going to back up because I'm going to do this backwards. You know, generally when I investigate, I oversaw the Kansas Bureau of Investigation as Attorney General, and additionally, I was a district attorney. And let me say, and if you will allow me, I'm going to ask you to indulge me in a couple of observations. And these observations, you might be redundant to your knowledge, but forgive me. No investigation starts with a conclusion. No investigation starts with a claim. Every investigation starts with questions. And so when you begin an investigation, you have to make sure that you're asking the right questions, and then you determine the most proper source to get answers for those questions so you can come to know what happened. And I want to invite all of you to participate in asking the right sources the right questions. Because some of the questions you will have are questions we cannot answer. But there are institutions and persons who have the answer. And they also control information such as video footage, such as logs, such as sign-in sheets for people who worked there or volunteered there, such as GPS positioning for tractors and trailers that work for the United States Postal Service or haul their mail. There are a lot of institutions you can go to ask the right questions. And I would invite you to participate with us in asking the right questions. And I want to offer this observation regarding evidence. I've never investigated an innocent person who did not want me to see the evidence they controlled that proved their innocence. And I've never investigated a guilty person who wanted me to see the evidence they controlled that proved their guilt. Most all criminal investigations, in fact, any investigation begins with the knowledge that something went wrong. There's a body in the road. Somebody has been shot. Somebody called 911. And most real investigation is if there's not an immediate threat to the public and we don't know who we have to chase to arrest, begins with moving backwards, not forwards. You begin to investigate backwards. And so that's how I'm going to lead you through our discussion, and it will lead up to Jesse Payne's story. Jesse Morgan. Jesse Payne was a prosecutor who worked for me. I'm sorry, Jesse. Thank you. Let's look at the blood in the street. I'm taking you over to our lawsuits right over here. These are lawsuits that we have filed. This one is in Pennsylvania. Thank you, Peter. And if you keep it, yeah, you're bringing it up? Thank you, so I can see it. What you have right here is a chart of several charts, in fact. That's okay, buddy. It's okay. We'll just go to Georgia. Keep Georgia up. This is our experts' analysis in Georgia of ballots called into question by the conduct of election officials that were in violation or sidestepped state election law. What you will see here is the first type, and let me tell you how we did this. We hired a data expert. We got the data from government. We hired some mathematicians to help crunch that data with them, and then we actually reached out and contacted voters directly to see if what they swore to as their conduct, whether they voted, whether they didn't vote, whether they requested a ballot, whether they didn't request a ballot, was mirrored by state records. And what you see right here is the estimate of illegal votes counted in Georgia at 15,331. Here is an estimate, I'm circling it, an estimate of Republican ballots that the Republican that we spoke with returned, but that state records show were not counted. 29,884. This is electors who voted where they did not reside in Georgia. 138,221. Out-of-state persons voting, 20,312. And double votes, 395. Total number of ballots in question, 204,143. We have these charts for each of the 5 states that we have recently initiated litigation in, and they will be provided to you. So how did this occur? How did it happen that these many ballots are called into question in this investigation? This is the blood in the street, so to speak. This is the evidence that something wrong occurred. Maybe not a crime. Maybe people were negligent. Maybe people did a poor job. But it certainly introduces questions that we must answer. And so we start to back up. And what we see in each one of these swing states is something else that hasn't happened before. It's the consolidation of counting centers, a dramatic consolidation in the urban core of the counting centers. Now, that was done, and the explanation was COVID, that it was necessary because of COVID. I will accept that at face value, accept to state it doesn't make any sense to create a crowd to help protect against COVID. But nonetheless, they brought those persons together. Now, let's take a look at what happened in the counting centers, because there are also 2 other effects, even assuming that the proper purpose was COVID. What else happened in the counting centers? Well, I'll just take a couple of examples for you, and I'm sorry, again, I'm being redundant. You have heard this before, but it's important to understand it in the context of the story. In Michigan, I call it, what is the center called? TCF Center, the TCF Center in Michigan, the former hockey arena that they consolidated in Wayne County for the count. There were 134 counting or tables set up for each of those wards. Around them were inspectors. Those inspectors had the responsibility to take all ballots that they claimed couldn't run through the machine and then set those ballots down, including all military ballots because of the paper that it's on. Look at those ballots and then say this person meant to vote for Biden or for Trump, and fill out pristine new ballots. These ballots would then separated, and they would cast ballots for persons who weren't there, completing ballots of third parties who weren't there. The law allows that, by the way, because you want to be efficient in counting the ballot. But the law also says the 2 major parties must be at that table. They must be able to see what happened and then sign off that it was done validly. That's a way of putting America in the counting room. Both major political parties watching what happens. That's fair. That's transparent elections. In Wayne County, it didn't happen. What they argued is that there was a Republican in the place. They put him in the penalty box, and they couldn't see what was happening at the table. So whether you think that's nefarious or not, that's one of the results of the consolidation of the counting centers, is that they removed what the law required, and you had partisans completing these ballots without oversight from America or the other political party as the law requires. So people violate the law for a reason. What is the reason that they violated that law? Additionally, I can tell stories in Philadelphia. I can tell stories in Fulton County, Georgia. I can tell stories in Phoenix, Arizona. But you hear those stories. You know those affidavits. You know that that happened. There are serious questions that result from it. Additionally, consolidating the counting facilities in conjunction with drop boxes with the introduction of drop boxes. By the way, most of these drop boxes were paid for by Mark Zuckerberg's contribution to a group called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, and more on that a little bit later. Drop boxes hold anywhere from 4,000 votes or absentee ballots to up to 75,000 absentee ballots. This breached the chain of custody of the ballot in a significant way unless these officials also, thank you, there's a drop box right here. And you might recall, as it relates to drop boxes, we were promised 24/7 security. We were promised videos to watch the drop boxes. By the way, has anybody seen the videos that these election officials for every drop box that was out there? We were promised that there would be integrity in the flow and chain of custody of these ballots. That means they must have laws of who had keys to the drop boxes. That means legitimately they have to have a 2-person per key system so that there's not one partisan who might pick up those ballots in a heavily Republican area and lose them on the way to the counting center, or vice versa, pick up ballots in a heavily Democrat area and lose them on the way to the counting center. Did they have 2-person, 1 key? Do they have the logs of when these drop boxes were picked up? Will they ever release video of these drop boxes as they promised? So far, we have demanded such information. It has been refused. People refuse for a reason. What is that reason? We have election experts that have been working with us who say that that conduct in breaking the chain of custody prevents the certification of the election process as applied under federal law, the Help America Vote Act. And we will have their testimony moving forward in numerous cases that the way that they did this election was not consistent with federal law in every one of these urban areas in every swing state. And the question is, why? Why not follow the law? So we've started moving backwards. And as we move backwards to understand exactly what happened in these counting centers and recognize that all of these drop boxes and the consolidation of the counting centers allowed for and justified the delivery of tens of thousands of ballots, hundreds of thousands of ballots late in the election in one location with 1 truck or 2 trucks delivering in an area that is away from any partisan observers, we began to have more questions. You see, if you're going to infuse a lot of fraudulent ballots into a system with a machine counting system, you've got a couple of things you have to take care of. First of all, I see some of you with your computers. And yeah, I remember my first computer was about this big, and it was less powerful than my watch. But now these things do amazing things. And they also count our ballots. But you can't see how they are counting them. You can't see in that machine. No one can, unless you're able to have access and print off logs which show how that machine has been operating. We have demanded the logs. There are certain types of logs that talk about the access the machine records. Any other access, it records all it's doing. No one has produced logs. No one. Why? In fact, it is our belief that in some of these areas, the state contract actually allows the log to be the proprietary property of the vendor. If that is the case, we have signed away our right to see how the machines are operating. That in and of itself should be a national controversy. But let me move on a little bit further as it relates to the machines. Gregory Stenstrom saw behavior in Delaware County, and there are affidavits elsewhere, that show intentional conduct that are a breach in election procedures and actually collectively. I'm not saying they did. It is a good question for them. Actually would allow the alteration of the count, but most certainly breaks the chain of custody from critical jump drives or V-chips to the machines, to the precinct, to the ballot, that makes auditing extraordinarily difficult. Intentional conduct that makes auditing the performance of those machines to the integrity of the count extraordinarily difficult. So right now I'd like to have Mr. Stenstrom come up and share with you what he experienced in Delaware County.
Thank you, Phil. I was a Republican poll watcher and observer in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. As I previously testified before a special committee of the Pennsylvania legislature in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania last Wednesday, I'm a citizen, a former commanding executive officer in the Navy, a veteran of foreign wars, a data scientist, and an expert in security and fraud. I witnessed irregularities at 7 polls and 22 precincts on Election Day, primarily poll workers providing voters regular ballots instead of provisional ballots, when records indicated that those voters had requested mail-in ballots. But what I observed at the centralized Delaware County vote counting center when I arrived there at 6 p.m. and then over the next 3 days was a forensically destructive process that involved mail-in ballots, Dropbox ballots, and electronic USB V-card vote uploads. Despite possessing valid credentials, it was a 5-hour battle just to gain entry to the main counting room. And it would be another 3 days before I could secure a court order to observe the sequestered back rooms for 5 minutes for every 2 hours to observe ballots and how they were ingested. When I was finally allowed inside, I saw many boxes of 500 ballots each being carried in and out of the sequestered back room. The election officials in charge of operations refused to let me or other credentialed observers inside the room, even though we had every right to enter, and objected. There were disturbing breaches of protocol taking place in plain sight. At one point, I saw unsecured USB V-card drives from voting machines being separated from their accompanying cartridges and paper tapes and commingled together by election workers. These actions destroyed any forensic auditability and corrupted the chain of custody. Formal objections to election officials and law enforcement officers that were present went unanswered. Later, I saw the voting machine warehouse supervisor for Delaware County carrying in unsealed bags of unsecured USB V-card drives, which he inexplicably proceeded to plug into computers, the vote counting computers, and upload into the official vote tally. Despite formal objections to senior law enforcement that was present and election board officials, he was allowed to continue. When he was finished, the vote count shot up by 50,000 votes for Vice President Biden. 47 USB cards were missing at the end of last week. As of today, that number has reportedly grown to 64. When I finally gained access to the sequestered room, this is the 3 days later, where mail-in ballots were ingested, I witnessed 60 to 70,000 unopened mail-in ballots in sequestered back offices. That was on Thursday at 3:30, after the vote was supposedly counted. They remain unaccounted for. We don't know where they are. All signed paper chain of custody documents are missing, despite attempts by Democrat election officials to recreate them. My questions then and now remain, Where did the ballots come from? Where did these mail-in ballots come from? And where did they go? Thank you for your time. Phil, appreciate being here.
And there's another question. Why? Why engage in conduct that you know destroys the chain of custody of this important material in a vital election, unless there is an objective? People don't violate the law intentionally unless they have a reason. What could be the reason? And so we started to explore backwards again. I'm taking you backwards. How would you use that destruction of evidence, and why would it be necessary to destroy this evidence to engage in this conduct? Well, you have to understand what evidence is within the machine. What evidence is trying to be separated from us so that we do not know what happened. These machines capture images of the ballots. Those ballots, in fact, are tied down per precinct. The ballot design comes from the vendor itself, and they have to be specific with these updates to know, for example, if you move one precinct over, you might be voting for a different city council member. So there's a way to audit whether ballots were counted right within the precinct. And if you're going to infuse hundreds of thousands of ballots quickly, you might not be able to make sure that the right machine involved in the right count could count those ballots. Separating the chain of custody makes it extraordinarily more difficult. Another thing that you could do is not vote down ticket, so that that information doesn't cause a red flag. Moreover, on these ballots and in this process, there are barcodes that give us an awful lot of information that help us audit this process if we have access to the ballots themselves, which no one has been allowed to have access to. So now we got drop boxes. We got a break in the chain of custody. We got all this alteration of election procedures. We've got different laws being applied in different ways in the same state. And we have the consolidation of counting centers. But if you're going to make an impact in an election, you have to be able to control the vote of a certain number of people. So you can't just intercept and guess whether it's a Republican vote or a Democrat vote on the ballot. It doesn't make sense to just take a guess at a drop box and say that looks Republican, that looks Democrat. You can do some of that by the precinct and by the identification of the voter history in that area, but that is extraordinarily difficult to pull off. So how do you inject fraudulent ballots into the stream to be counted? Well, there are a couple of things, and I'm not saying that this is the path, but this reality, this truth demands questions and demands hard answers and hard evidence. We have had an unprecedented first-time partnership between blue state officials and private parties to share access to sensitive government information. I'll give you one example. I'll give you more than one, I'm sorry. Michigan. There is a company called NGP Van that is a tech firm that is left-leaning, that consolidates data, monetizes information, and helps Democrat candidates. They're also a fundraising arm for leftist causes. That's their job. That's how they make money. There's communication between Governor Whitmer, her political director, and the state health director in Michigan, where they are negotiating how to give NGP Van the contract for COVID tracing without anyone knowing of it. It was suggested that NGP Van create a subsidiary called Michigan Van, and that Michigan Van become a subcontractor for the general contractor on COVID tracing. I believe you all know all of the sensitive information that will be required by law to be turned over to COVID tracers if they knock on your door and hear that you were exposed to COVID. That's the type of data mining that people have made billions of dollars on. Once the whistle was blown on the negotiation of that contract, the governor disclaimed any knowledge of it, ordered her health officials to renege on the contract, and backed out of it. But there's more. The Secretary of State of Michigan and in Pennsylvania each engaged Rock the Vote to give them a front-side portal into the qualified voter files. You see, previously, if the League of Women Voters was conducting a voter registration drive, you would fill out a piece of paper. They would take that paper to the county clerk, election clerk, and only the clerk could enter that information into the qualified voter files. That's important for three primary reasons. The clerk is defined by geography. They only enter registrants relating to their county. That gives an accountability to them. They are subject to Freedom of Information Act requests and demands for information, so you can hold them accountable if they enter fraudulent names. They also have political accountability. They are voted out of office if they fail. Rock the Vote has none of those checks upon them. These third parties don't have those checks upon them. Now, I will tell you, and you don't have to speak to many people, you know identity theft is a big issue in America. It's a big issue around the world. There are groups, and they don't have to have extraordinary talent, that can obtain personal information about you very easily. There's actually groups that consolidate data and sell them, like the National Change of Address reports, like reports regarding deaths, marriages, changes of name. All of those things are data that you can get and crunch. I could get your Social Security number with a little bit of work, not much. So I'm not saying Rock the Vote did anything nefarious. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have opened up a vulnerability on the front end of our voter rolls intentionally through these contracts. It would be very easy for a volunteer to suddenly create voters that weren't otherwise there. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues at Liberty University School of Law, where I teach, a former acting dean, Rena Linda-Voltson. I've got Rena's affidavit here. She was born in Michigan as Annie Billis, B-I-L-A-S. She never registered to vote under that name. Her parents always called her Rena. As she grew up and she reached the age of majority, she changed her name. And by the way, changes of name and those lists are also available. She legally changed her name to Rena. So she was Rena Billis. Then she voted for Michael Dukakis. Not as Rena Billis. It might be after she was married, but she voted for Dukakis in 1994. She was a little bit hesitant for me to say that because she knows my history as a Republican. But she voted for Michael Dukakis. Then she moved out of Michigan. She got married, and now her name is Rena Linda-Voltson. And she hasn't been called Annie Billis since she was 18, and she never registered under that name. With all this talk of fraud, now what are the odds that Rena Linda-Voltson would go back and check at her Michigan registration when she's living in Virginia to see if she was registered under a name she never registered? You see, you can look at all these voting histories and you can tell who never votes. You can determine who's not going to check their voting history. You can also obtain names that center around their identity but are actually false. She was registered in Michigan as Annie Billis. Somebody did that, not her. And the question is why? Well, I believe we're starting to get an understanding of the why. There was a front door portal that was opened up to our voting rolls that had not been opened in this way before. Those are serious questions to ask those persons who opened up those portals. We have demanded and demanded and demanded the contracts. We had 10 FOIA requests. We're denied each one, and we just got them. And in our analysis, they pose significant problems for the operation of elections. Now, they will tell you, I assure you, that everything's fine. There's no fraud going on. That is an actual quote of an election official in Delaware County to Gregory Stenstrom when he was trying to get in the room that he had the right to get into, and he saw people moving around. It was mail crates of ballots. Mail crates. And they said, I assure you, everything's fine. There's no fraud going on. At some point, that answer does not hold. At some point, it doesn't hold. So one of the important things I want to mention and highlight about Gregory's statement is he saw those mail bins. I don't know if you know what I'm speaking about. We've got pictures of them somewhere up here, don't we, Peter? The actual mail bins of the bulk mail. Thank you. This is going to tie to Jesse Morgan's story. Not that, I'm sorry. We'll get to that. Do we have the picture of the bulk mail plastic bins? I thought I saw it. We'll find it for you. You might have seen it. I don't know if any of you have done bulk mail, but there's these heavy plastic bins, and you insert the bulk mail vertically, and you generally organize it by zip code to make it efficient. And Greg saw many of those being brought in to that counting center in Delaware County. That type of bulk mail. Here it is. These plastic bins right here. They're in different sizes, but Greg, you saw these types of bins in the Delaware Counting Center. And that's important when we get to Jesse Morgan's story here in a minute. So you have to control some of the ballots. We've shown how perhaps you can create persons like that and cast ballots on their behalf. And I would encourage you, again, to look at our lawsuits. You will see that there are ballots being cast for persons that didn't cast them. I'm looking right now. It's right there on the bottom, 29,000 in Georgia. Right here. Yeah, I got it. No, I'm sorry. It's 15,331. Ballots that were not requested that were cast. Right there. And that's in one category that we're seeing that. So we know ballots that weren't requested were cast. We know there are ways to create identities to cast those ballots, and we have sworn statements supporting that. So now how do you enter these ballots into the counting stream? How do you infuse tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of ballots into the counting stream? Well, we have with us Ethan Pease. Ethan was a subcontractor for a postal a company that delivered mail in Madison, Wisconsin. And he's going to tell you his story about backmarking ballots in the post office. Now, I want to say this. You've heard this pop up elsewhere. Traverse City, Michigan. Whistleblower steps forward and said the postmaster ordered him to backdate ballots. You all know about the gentleman in Erie, Pennsylvania that they claim recanted, but then he said, I never recanted. He overheard it. There's also Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, in which a gentleman was told that he must throw away or put in the bulk undeliverable mail, all Trump mail, and deliver Biden mail. There's a lot of whistleblowers in the United States Postal Service that give pause for concern. And Ethan has come forward and is going to share his story about concerns in Madison, Wisconsin.
Thank you, Phil. During the run-up to and on Election Day, I was working as a temporary hire at United Mailing Services, UMS, a USPS subcontractor in Wisconsin. I began employment on August 26, 2020 as a route driver and box truck driver. This meant my job was to pick up mail on a predetermined route and deliver it to UMS for sorting and metering. I would then take the sorted mail in my box truck to USPS. In September or October, I began to deliver mail-in ballots from UMS to USPS as part of my evening delivery duties. I knew this because there was special bins marked for ballots only. On one occasion, I forgot to retrieve the ballots for transportation and had to go back for them. After that, I always made sure to check that I had the ballot bins loaded for transport. On November 2nd, 2020, I noticed that there was only one ballot in the bin for delivery to USPS. And on November 3rd, Election Day, there were no ballots in the bin for delivery. One can imagine my surprise then when the next day, November 4th, I was asked by a senior USPS employee named Monte if I had forgotten any ballots the night before. Monte explained that an order came down from the Wisconsin-Illinois chapter of USPS that 100,000 ballots were missing. Monte then told me that his post office had dispatched employees to look for the missing ballots around 4 a.m., and that only 7 or 8 were found at UMS. Based on my previous experience and habit of double-checking for ballots, I believe that to be a lie. The following day, November 5th, 2020, I had a conversation with a different USPS employee named Rachel, in which she admitted that USPS employees were ordered to backdate ballots that were received too late to be lawfully counted. I asked Rachel if I would get in trouble with my boss for those ballots the other night, referring to the allegedly missing ballots I discussed with USPS employee Monte on November 4th, 2020. "No, you wouldn't," she responded, "as long as they were postmarked for the 3rd. She continued, "That's why they had us do that." I didn't bring any of this to the attention of my supervisors at USPS at the time due to what I perceived to be their hostility towards President Donald Trump and their evident contempt for the law. I heard those same 2 post office employees making jokes about taking mail-in ballots for Trump and throwing them away. I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm not a Biden supporter either. In fact, I didn't vote for either of the main candidates. But something profoundly wrong occurred in Wisconsin during the presidential election, and the American people have a right to know about it. Thank you.
Now, you probably caught that, but it is significant that Ethan firmly believes that he did deliver all ballots, and that falsely postal workers claimed at a time when they were told to round up 100,000 ballots, found ballots within the stream of mail that he was responsible for. So perhaps Ethan missed those 8 or so ballots. Or perhaps there's an intentional insertion of fraudulent ballots that were completed by others into the stream of mail for ballots to be counted. Either way, these ballots were illegitimate in that they should have been postmarked November 4th rather than November 3rd. Now, falsely postmarking the mail is a crime. People don't do crimes idly. They do it for a reason. What could be the reason? Now, I want to turn now to Jesse Morgan, and I want to set the scene a little bit and explain to you my initial interview with him in which Colonel Schaefer accompanied me. Jesse runs a mail route for his employer, 10 Roads Express. And from the end of September through October 21st, when this incident occurred, it was pretty routine. The post office likes routine. I mean, that's efficient. People show up at a certain time, they arrive, they dock, they unload, they load, they get to the next station at a specific time. And the post office keeps track of this all of the time. Jesse, I'll ask him to describe, because I might not describe it fully or correctly, but when he backs up to a dock, for example, for his trailer to be unloaded, well, let me back up. As he first pulls into some postal facilities, he shows his identity. It's a badge. And he receives a slip wherever he goes that identifies who he is and basically indicates what's on that truck, what's part of the load, that he's been there. He backs up to the dock, and an expediter will come out, and they will use a scanner, and they scan. I'm going to forget all the things they scan. There's a dock scan, right? There's a dock scan, and he's going to do this much better than I am. I'm sorry, buddy. And then they also are going to scan a metal seal that is put on the back of that trailer that can't be opened unless you tear the seal. So they know nobody has been in to steal from that load or alter that load. It has a barcode on it. They will scan that. And then each of the pallets sometimes has data that they scan. So they're keeping track of all of this. Moreover, Jesse's driving a truck that has GPS that he can only drive when he signs in on an electronic board that keeps track of wherever he goes. There's also identification on the trailer, so that they can specifically identify the trailer. Now, Jesse, during this time, by the way, that he's running this route we're going to be speaking about, is using the same trailer. You love that trailer, right? It was a good trailer. It was a good trailer. It had suspension, right? He describes it better than I, but, it kept good traction on the road. You can handle in water. It had some kind of lift on it. I don't understand. I have trouble changing the oil. I'm sorry, Jesse. I'm bad at this. He loved that trailer. It worked for him. He'd driven other trailers, and they were worse trailers than that one. So he had trailer 10R1440 all the time on that route. Now, Jesse would roll out of bed. He'd go and pick up his tractor, which was parked in the Auto One parking lot, which is a car dealership there in Lancaster. He'd do all of his checks. He'd get in his truck. He'd sign in, and then he'd roll over to the Lancaster post office, where he'd back up to pretty much the same dock, maybe another dock, and they would load him up. Or did they already have you loaded? They loaded you? Already loaded. Or process. He'd hook up his tractor. They'd get done with it. He'd check his load, because one time he didn't, and it shifted, and he jackknifed on the road. It was a scary, scary event. And so he always checked his load. He'd walk in there, make sure it's balanced. They'd shut it. They'd slap on the seal. They'd do all their scanning, and Jesse's on the road from Lancaster, Pennsylvania to Bethpage, New York. And he loved driving into New York, especially that time of day. Early morning hours. He'd leave. He'd roll out about 1 a.m. You get up to Bethpage 4 or so, 4:15, 4:20. Beautiful, seeing the city without all the traffic. He'd pull into Bethpage, back up to the same dock. The expediters are there. They'd have some small chat, but really weren't friends. Jesse stayed on his job. He was polite. Jesse, not political, not he'll tell you he didn't vote for either one. Doesn't follow the news much. So he's up there, and they're loading up these ballots. He didn't even notice this time on October 21st. He didn't notice at first that it was ballots, didn't think much of it. And he'll tell you about that, and then I'll come back to that. But his route's always the same. Then he gets loaded up, and he comes back to Harrisburg. Now, I want to explain something to you. Where's that? And you guys will understand this. This is not his truck. But generally, he's hauling from Bethpage what will go to Lancaster and Harrisburg. But his route takes him to Harrisburg first, which means you have to load Lancaster up there in the back of the trailer, the nose of the trailer. Yeah. They would load Lancaster first and then Harrisburg. So when he arrived in Harrisburg, Harrisburg could be taken off and the Lancaster load was there. And then he would drive to Lancaster. You can imagine the confusion and the delay that would be caused if Jesse decided he wasn't going to Harrisburg first, but he went to Lancaster. Then they would have to take off the Harrisburg load, then get the Lancaster load, then reload Harrisburg to have him drive to Harrisburg. So the post office has got this down. Despite all the complaints, they have all the loading and the logistics and the systems to run efficiently. So his typical day is that he goes down from Bethpage to Harrisburg. He unloads, pulls up to the dock. They